Hi everyone, this is Ted Bauman, editor of the Bauman Letter, and welcome to your first video edition of the Bauman Daily. I'm going to be releasing videos every Friday. Now, this particular video, the first one that I'm releasing as part of the Bauman Daily series, is actually a continuation of a YouTube series that I've been doing for some time on anti-competitive behavior and anti-competitive concentrated markets in the United States. Now, if you're not familiar with this series, the background is that I realized that a lot of my readers, people who read the Bauman Letter, were writing in saying, I am trying to make ends meet. I want to invest to increase my income. But making ends meet is not just a question of income, it's also a question of cost. And it got me thinking about how so many people blame themselves for a situation which is not really their fault. For example, in my last couple of videos, I've talked extensively about how the US healthcare industry is not only the most expensive in the developed world, but it's also that way because of just a shocking lack of competition, particularly amongst hospitals, and most importantly, the way that the insurance system interacts with employment through employer-provided healthcare in the United States. My reason for going through these things is to drive home the fact that a lot of things that that end up making us struggle as individuals, particularly when we get older and retire, is not actually our fault. It's due to things that could be changed and should be changed. So I decided to do a series on competitive behavior in the United States. And if you go back and look at my earlier videos, you will see that the United States increasingly is a less competitive economy than many of the other advanced economies in the world, particularly compared to places like Europe and East Asia. And the consequence of that is that we pay higher prices for inferior quality goods and services than in many countries that are same level of development as we are. And in almost every case, the problem is a failure to look at the consequences of concentration and for government to act appropriately to try to adjust it. The background is that for most of the United States in its history, the government has taken a fairly active role in trying to make the economy as competitive as possible, both to encourage innovation, but also to ensure that prices don't get out of hand. Starting in the 1980s, the US government changed all of that. Now today, I'm going to be talking about the consequences of that change in attitude for one particular industry, that is the broadband industry. Now, I want to start by showing you some graphs, but first, if you were to tell somebody in Hong Kong or Singapore or Norway how much you pay for your broadband internet service in the United States, they would probably be shocked. America invented the internet, but we have fallen way behind in terms of the quality of the service that we receive, as well as the prices that we pay compared to other countries. Now, right now, the United States is ranked 37th in the world in terms of mobile broadband speeds, way behind countries like China, Lebanon, Hungary, Greece, Oman. All of those countries have faster mobile broadband speeds than we do. We're ranked better in terms of fixed broadband. We're 9th in the world, but we're behind countries like Romania, South Korea, and Hong Kong. If they can do it, why can't we? Well, in fact, it's not just a question of having slower speeds. We also have much higher costs than other countries. People living in Iran or Ukraine or Russia pay just a fraction of what we pay for sometimes superior service. And at the highest speeds, the kind of speeds that you need to be a participant in the modern digital economy, the average US subscriber pays nearly 3 times as much as in the United Kingdom or France. We pay 5 times as much as South Korea. So let's look at a couple of charts that illustrate what I'm saying. The first chart shows that of countries with high-speed broadband of 45 megabits per second or more, the United States is far and away the most expensive compared to countries like South Korea and even the poor old Slovak Republic. They have much less expensive broadband. Our speeds, by contrast, are not anything to write home about. They're much faster in France. They're faster in Slovenia. In fact, they are faster in almost all of the countries except Japan. Well, that's actually it. Japan is about the same as we are. Now, if you look at it from a city basis, the next chart, you can see that people living in San Francisco or New York or Washington, D.C. Are paying far more for fast broadband than people in other cities. And even though in many cases it's faster, the increase in price is disproportionate to what we're actually getting. Finally, here is a list that shows the top and the bottom countries for broadband costs around the world. And as you can see, the United States ranks 114th. That's the average cost of a broadband plan in the United States. That's a little bit less than what I actually pay, for example. But nevertheless, you can see that there are countries that are not all that, well, in fact, many of them are far behind us in terms of economic development that pay a lot less than we do. Now, there are a variety of reasons for this. Now, one reason is that some of the countries obviously subsidize broadband internet. Other countries have different competitions policies. But let's start with what's going on here in the United States. The bottom line is that just like in healthcare, the reason why we pay so much for less service, less quality, slower speeds, more outages, poor customer service, is because of a lack of competition. Starting in the 1980s, the Federal Communication Commission started to take a hands-off approach towards high-speed internet. And basically, that has really been the case ever since the Reagan presidency. There were attempts under the Obama presidency to try to intervene again, but by that time, the broadband industry had become so powerful with such big lobbying forces and so much money to spend donating to politicians' campaigns that they were able to avoid substantial regulation. Now, the critical thing is that the consequence of this lack of attention to trying to increase competition in the broadband industry has really led to a situation where many people in the United States only have one or two options for internet or cable service, often from the same companies. And in many cases, for faster speeds, they only have one choice. So really, the problem comes down to understanding why we don't have competition at local areas. Even though there are dozens of internet service providers around the country, in many specific cities, we only have a few of them. I'll talk about why in a minute. So that's one problem, lack of competition. The other one is that without any kind of a regulatory environment that encourages it, broadband internet simply does not go to rural areas. My mom, for example, who lives in rural Virginia near the Chesapeake Bay, has terrible internet service. It's really bad. Essentially what she gets is a kind of a feed from a dish across the river from where she lives that is connected to a company that gets its broadband from another service provider. She pays a huge amount of money for it. It's slow. It's often down for days at a time. That's the case all over the country. And the problem there, again, comes back to the question of how internet access is treated compared to things like telephones, for example, or electricity supply. So we'll get back to that in a minute. So essentially what's happened is that we have a situation where we have extremely expensive internet compared to the rest of the world. Many people in the United States, particularly in areas that are economically struggling, like rural areas, can't get it at all. And as a result, we have seen attempts by local governments to step in where the national and state governments haven't. But that creates an interesting case study in the problem that we have. One of my favorite examples is Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is a couple of hours drive from my house here in Atlanta. Now, Chattanooga decided some years ago to establish its own municipal broadband service. The rationale was that it would help to increase the economic competitiveness of the city of Chattanooga as a destination for tech industry investment. That sounds like a great idea, right? I mean, the city of Chattanooga has its own electricity supply system, so it decided it was going to string cable internet access using the same rights of way, the same poles, the same underground cables and things like that, so it wouldn't really be a very expensive proposition. But what happened? Well, the big cable providers, AT&T, Comcast, and others, went to the legislature in Tennessee and tried to get the legislature there to pass a law forbidding local authorities from establishing their own municipal broadband systems in competition with their own. And in that case, it failed. And in fact, this has been attempted in a number of countries, or rather cities around the country. There are now dozens of cities who have done this, but it illustrates the problem that the big broadband and cable companies have taken an advantage that they got. I'm going to tell you where that came from in a minute, and it's pretty ironic. And they've used it to build up power, which they can then use to lobby government to protect their market position against local authorities that want to do something to try to enhance their own people's access to internet and cable and other things. So this comes to the question of how these companies got so powerful in the first place. Why is it that here in Atlanta, I can only really get broadband internet from a handful of companies, AT&T or Comcast, or sometimes Verizon, but in not all neighborhoods? Well, it goes back to something that I mentioned earlier. Remember when I talked about Chattanooga and the telephone poles and the wires? Well, when cable first came around, it was in the 1940s, and we're talking cable television here, which is kind of the precursor to internet. And at the time, it was a new technology that required the stringing of lots of cables to connect people's houses to a television signal, as opposed to getting it through an antenna through the free-to-air. Now, who owns all the rights of way along streets in most cities? Well, the municipalities do. So back in the 40s and 50s, the municipalities figured, well, television and electricity and gas services are all pretty much the same. They're basically utilities. They're what we call a natural monopoly. You're not going to build two gas lines for two competing companies. You're not going to build two electricity lines if you have more than one electricity provider. Instead, what you're going to do is use the existing infrastructure and have companies share it. In other words, they would compete with each other to basically get access to customers through a single line. So for example, here in Atlanta, I get my gas supply through a line that has been around for a long time, but the natural gas providers are actually fairly competitive. All of them compete to get access to that one line, and that ensures that prices stay low. But when it comes to cable and broadband internet, which eventually evolved from the cable companies, the situation is very different. When they first started stringing their wires along the same telephone poles that we have on our streets, they basically decided to divide up the geography of the United States into different areas. And so the cable companies ended up really focusing on a handful of cities in particular areas and not competing with each other. But instead of recognizing that this created a monopoly situation, most municipalities simply tolerated this situation. But by the 1980s, a situation arose where these companies started to use the fact that they were the only supplier of cable and increasingly internet to different cities to start raising their prices. But by that time, they had privileged access to the rights of way, the telephone poles and the underground cabling systems that were owned by the cities. And the money that they got from having this natural monopoly went back into lobbying to try to prevent municipalities from allowing competitors. So for example, whereas here in Atlanta, I can get my gas supplied by up to a dozen different companies using the same pipeline, if I want to get a different internet service from my house, somebody has to come and string a different cable. And the existing internet providers fight tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. So essentially what we have is a situation where through the agreement of local authorities, public entities in the United States who gave access to rights of way to all these companies over the years, they have managed to establish natural monopolies in their areas simply by virtue of the fact that they control these rights of way and they don't want to give them up. And that means that you can't have competition. And the result of that lack of competition, which goes back to the 40s and 50s and decisions made then, means that we pay higher prices for lower products than in other countries. Now, what other countries do is they regulate the price of broadband because it's a monopoly. They say, well, you guys have access to public rights of way. Those belong to the local governments. Therefore, you're getting a freebie. Effectively, you're getting something from the public sphere that helps you to make money. And in return for that, we want you to charge lower prices. Now, that's one way governments do it. In other cases, they force providers to share their infrastructure. For example, in my house in South Africa, in Cape Town, they've been installing cable internet recently. But the thing is, it's not one company's cable. It's a company who installs it, and there can be up to half a dozen different companies competing to supply me with internet service through that cable. And that guarantees that I get the best price possible. In the United States, if the cable belongs to AT&T, even if it's on public land, only AT&T controls it. And that's fundamentally unfair. It's a public right-of-way. It should be free to everybody. So that's how other countries do it. They basically decide to regulate that. Now, the second reason why things have become so expensive, it's not directly related to broadband, but essentially what's happened is that the massive amounts of money that these companies have made through access to these privileged monopoly positions over the years, created by local government and by law, and the lack of any federal regulation over their competitive behavior means that they've earned super profits. They've earned monopoly profits. They've been able to charge you and I more than the actual economic cost of producing broadband. If they can do it in South Korea for 1/5 the cost that we do, we should be able to do it here, but it doesn't happen. And that extra 80% that we pay goes into their coffers, which they can then use for lobbying, but also to buy other companies. So what's happened is big broadband suppliers like AT&T and Comcast have bought companies that produce the content that is delivered over broadband. And that gives them incentive to try to force you to consume their content as opposed to somebody else's. Now, one of the things that the Obama administration tried to do was to force carriers like AT&T and Comcast and Charter and Fox and all the others to treat everybody's information flowing on their networks equally. In other words, they couldn't throttle a competitor's streaming TV service like Netflix. Unfortunately, the Trump administration's FCC overruled that. But what's interesting is that a solid majority of Americans, something like 75 to 80%, approved of that ruling, and yet it was overruled. Why is that? Well, again, it's because these companies have earned massive profits, and they've turned them into a fantastic lobbying scheme. In fact, most of the people who staff the Federal Communications Commission are ex-lobbyists. They're people who used to work for the big cable companies. It's like having the fox looking after the proverbial hen house. Now, I know that sounds nasty, but this is not something that's specific to the Trump administration. It's not about Republicans versus Democrats. It's just the way things is here in the United States. To change that, ordinary people like you and me first need to be educated. We need to take the information like what I'm sharing with you and spread it around. Tell people this is why things are expensive. It doesn't have to be this way. Other countries pay less, just like they do for healthcare, for better services. And again, this is the kind of stuff that we need to pay attention to when there are debates about these issues in the press. And we should be telling our politicians and our representatives that we want things to be different as well. The bottom line is that when a company like AT&T or Comcast gets a huge favor from the public sphere in the form of access to low-cost rights-of-way on public land, they should be forced either to share that with anybody else who wants to provide a competitive service, or they should basically have regulated prices just like we do in electricity or gas or any other natural monopoly utility. Until that happens, you and I are going to continue to pay through the nose for lower quality services than pretty much everybody else, not only in the developed world, but increasingly in the less developed world as well. So this is Ted Bauman with your first Bauman Daily video, but which one is part of a longer series. I would encourage you to go and look at the playlist of all those previous videos and send in your comments. Let me know what you think about them. You can send them into our Bauman Daily email. You can send them to the Bauman Letter email if you're a subscriber there. Or you can leave comments on the YouTube page itself. And lastly, if you are not a Bauman Letter subscriber already, please do look at the text underneath this video where you can see a link where you can consider whether or not to subscribe to my product. I normally write about investment opportunities to help you gain income, but I'm also committed to providing you information like this to make sure you don't lose the income that you earned unnecessarily. Until next week, this is Ted Bauman signing off. I'll talk to you soon.